Hi, and welcome to the very first episode of the series titled Typical Mistakes at the Amateur Level, a series of videos where I will take games sent to me by different people, users, viewers, random people on the internet, and then annotate them in greater depth and analyze them in the video format with specific emphasis of the typical mistakes committed at a certain level. The idea behind is that by observing very common mistakes that are repeated in thousands of games and understanding what are the origins of these mistakes and how we can avoid them, hopefully it will help you as a viewer to avoid these very mistakes and improve your chess game one step at a time. So let's dive deep into the first game. The following game was sent to me by a Twitter user who responded to my plea when I asked people or chess punks on Twitter to send me their games from this series, and we will be observing it from the black perspective. Both players are rated around 700 rapid online, this time on chess.com. So the game started with the move knight to c3 by white, and this is already the first moment where we can actually make a certain comment. So usually it is recommended for beginners to follow chess principles, basic principles, and to develop the pieces and to control the center. And playing these kinds of wacky openings as one knight c3 is something I personally wouldn't recommend, for example, if these people were my students, because you are not controlling the center with your pawns, which is one of the main principles or goals from the beginning. Of course, it is possible to play like this, and this opening has a right to exist, but if we are strictly speaking from the learning perspective, it is probably better to follow more standard principles and then learn how to break them than vice versa. Although, of course, if you are enjoying playing this wacky stuff, it doesn't really matter because on the other hand, the outcome of the game is rarely, if ever, decided on the opening in the opening, not only on this level but also on higher levels. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but if that's what you do, would be my guess. So here, d5, e3, e5, black is playing very sensibly and occupying the center. As you can see, white is playing this setup with e3, not fighting for the center. And after knight f3, knight c6, white finally plays d4. And here we kinda have the first mistake, which may not be the most relevant at this particular level, but which is something that many people up to even higher level often do. So here black played e takes d4, which in my opinion is very characteristic of this level. Like, so now quite often what happens here is somebody offers the exchange and then the other side accepts it without asking themselves, do I really have to exchange? And in this particular instance, it was probably better not to exchange and to play e4, because this move is attacking this knight and forcing it to move again with a gain of tempo, and we are gaining space. So you can see that black is nicely controlling the center. Now, once again, in order to play like this, it is important to understand some more complicated concepts such as pawn chains, such as undermining breaks, which is why I don't necessarily think this is such a big mistake, or the most urgent mistake at this level, but I do want to emphasize more like a general principle. Don't exchange, or even always ask yourself, do I really need to exchange, or can I do something else? But okay, going forward with the game with e takes d4, e takes d4, now we see that kinda as a result of the exchange, of black's exchange, both sides have equal space in the center, which means that white's weird opening was somewhat justified. And here we have another kind of mistake, which is the move bishop to f5. Once again, it is not a big mistake. Like, I wouldn't say this is the most urgent mistake to correct at players at this level, but it is another mistake that doesn't follow basic chess principles. In this case, develop the knights before the bishops. So it's kind of difficult to explain in simple terms why it is better to play, for example, knight to f6 here, developing the knight, but very concisely, it is knights are much slower pieces and it takes them longer to get into the center. So it is always worth, or quite often worth, developing them first, because bishops have more options. This bishop can still go to f5, to g4, to e6, and can be more flexible. And as a general rule of thumb, unless there is a very specific reason to develop the bishop for very concrete gains, it is usually very much more preferable to develop the knight. Of course, as you grow in chess strength, you will realize that these principles are to be broken. But on these lower levels, I would suggest sticking to these basic principles. So control the center, castle quick, develop your pieces, and then some other like knights before the bishops, for example. But okay, after bishop to f5, bishop to b5, this is, for example, one of the problems. This pin on the knight is somewhat annoying. Once again, you are taught as a beginner that you shouldn't aim to give up your bishop for the knight, but if there is a concrete gain, and in this case it will be doubling of the pawn of the c pawns, then this exchange can be justified. Once again, these are a little bit more advanced concept. I wouldn't say that up to this point in the game any of the players did a very major mistake typical of that level, and I actually think they both played reasonably well up to this point, even though maybe the biggest mistake that they committed here. This was a 30-minute game, and at this point they both have more than 29 minutes. So both players were playing extremely quickly. And that, I think, is one of the, let's say, crimes at this level. Quite often it happens is that people simply don't use the time they have, and that hinders them. It results in blunders, and it doesn't teach you to think and play chess. So that would be one my main concern here, my main objection here. And this will be something that will also continue in the throughout the game. So here, this was the first moment where actually the first mistake happens. Here black played bishop to d6, not realizing that the pawn on d5 is under attack, that it is hanging. So one thing that is quite common on this level is people not paying attention to what unprotected pieces and unprotected pawns are in their position. As I mentioned in my comments, you can partly improve on this by experience, by practicing your tactics, and there is also a very great tool on Lichess that's called Hanging Pieces that teaches you to take or to defend exactly pieces that are not protected. And in this particular case, it was possible to take the pawn, because I'm not exactly sure why I didn't do it. Maybe they were fearing some potential attack on this knight, but it doesn't happening because there is nothing. With bishop b4 is the check that discovers the attack, but the knight is protecting that square, so knight takes b4 wins, and now black even can't recapture this knight because of the pin. So this kind of little idea doesn't work. Still, probably not the easiest tactic to see at this level, but still I think it should have been considered, especially since white played the move queen to e2 after only 2 seconds of thought out of 30 minutes. Now after bishop to e7, you can see that now, so black moved bishop to d6, and now they went bishop to e7, violating this principle of moving the same piece twice, although here at least the d5 pawn is defended. And now bishop to f4, very sensible, developing a piece. Knight e5 is nominally better, but that's not relevant here. Bishop f4, knight f6, bishop takes e6. Once again, this is a good move, even though white is giving up a bishop, because after b takes e6, black has these doubled pawns. And okay, double pawns are something that's very misunderstood. Many people fear them or overvalue them or undervalue them, but in this particular case, ruining of this pawn structure and creating doubled weak pawns is justifies giving up the bishop. And here we now have a very characteristic sequence of moves where white plays h3 and black plays c5. So if this was a little bit higher rated game, what I would expect here happening is both players castles and then taking it from there. And this is something that you will often see at this level. People simply not castling or doing something before castling, or just ignoring the safety of the king, ignoring the strength of getting their king into the corner on one side of the board. And if you are like at this level or watching this video, I would definitely suggest to you to make it sort of a habit or a rule to castle by move 10, by move 15, like make it as a goal. I want to castle in all my games by move 15, let's say, and then religiously stick to it. Once again, it is a little bit unflexible, but in the beginning you have to follow the principles so that you can break them later. So the problem with this h3 is that I'm not sure what the point of this move is. And here c5, black is trying to do something active in a position where they are not developed. And here d takes e5 could have been played utilizing this pin, and now black is kind of losing a pawn, at least for the moment. However, instead here white played rook to d1, kinda defending this pawn, maybe whining against the queen, but this is a little bit too defensive, I think. Not a big mistake, but it also shows a little bit of a defensive mindset. Oh, I just don't want to take anything, I just want to be safe. And now, finally, we get castles, and now rook b8, placing the rook on the open file, very good. And here, this is like a very typical scenario, so this is clear. It's clear to me from this game that these two players kinda know their stuff, they understand the principles of the opening, both sides have developed, both sides have mobilized their pieces, and now the difficult part is what next, what happens. And this is where the kind of bigger mistakes start to happen. So white starts with knight to h4, attacking this bishop on f5, and here black plays knight to e4. And this is actually a blunder because this completely ignores the attack on the f5 bishop. And this is another very typical mistake at this level. And you might be wondering, okay, but what's the origin? How can we explain it? Well, it's very, very simple. Very, very often at this level, people, A, don't pay attention to their pieces, as mentioned earlier, to their hanging pieces, and B, they are not paying attention to what their opponent is doing. So black was so intensely focused on attacking this knight with the bishop, uncovering this attack, that they completely forgot the fact that the knight can move and it can take on f5. And this kind of thing is solved once again. Spending more time practicing your tactics, practicing sets of hanging pieces, and making sure that you do some basic blunder checks during the game. And now after knight f5, knight to c3, b takes c3, rook to e8, the game is objectively lost for black because white has an extra piece, and an extra piece should be objectively more than enough material. Like if I had this position as white against Magnus Carlsen, I would expect to win it, even though I'm playing Magnus Carlsen. And here white played knight queen to g2, threatening mate in 1. Another thing that's maybe not too relevant here is when you are ahead in material, the easiest way of converting this is exchanging the material, because let's say if you have 10 points of the advantage, the opponent has 5. If you exchange 5 points, you will be 5 points and there will be 0. And it's always easier to win 5 versus 0 than 10 versus 5, nominally. It's a very, very general rule. But in this particular case, there's nothing wrong with threatening mate and playing for mate. But as a rule of thumb, you want to keep in mind that you want to keep things as simple as possible. So here queen g4 was played threatening mate, and now another very characteristic sequence happens where black totally ignores this threat. So once again, black is overly focused on playing their own moves that they totally don't ask themselves, okay, what does queen g4 do? Like maybe it is also a little bit lack of knowledge with the mating patterns, with the knight on f5, but also it is not asking themselves what the opponent is doing. And now after c takes d4, it's kind of amazing because white plays bishop to h6. I mean, correctly recognizing the idea that they should attack g7, but not really counting the defenders correctly. So this is kind of correlated to the hanging pieces problem. So people are not counting the attackers, counting the defenders, and paying attention to attacked and defend squares. Once again, trying to spend more time and practicing designated exercises devoted to this area is how you can get better at it, apart from experience and practice. And here, because here white could have ended the game immediately with queen to g7. So now bishop to h6, and now g6, knight takes d4, f5. This is also a mistake because white can take knight takes f5. So we will see here in this game that black has certain problems with something that's called pin. So pin is a tactical mechanism where a certain piece is unable to move because there is a piece of greater value behind it. In this particular case, the pawn on g6 can't move because the king is behind it, and taking the knight is illegal according to the rules of chess. And this is one of very, very commonly overlooked tactical motive. And once again, the way to deal with it is to try and solve designated pin exercises. So here, after queen to e2 was played, bishop c5, and now white is still winning. White still has an extra piece if they move the queen, for example, somewhere here, just to avoid this attack of the rook. But here white goes for something that is not ideal because they play knight to e6. And this is something that some coaches comment as is your move safe. So here we see that we have knight on a protected square, and then white voluntarily moves it to a square where the knight is entering a pin and where it is not supported by any pawn. So this pawn can potentially be a little bit weak here. And this is another very typical mistake. So white saw here, oh, I can play knight to e6, I can attack the queen, I can attack the bishop, and they stopped. And they didn't ask themselves, okay, but does that actually do anything? And in view of what I said earlier, in positions where you are material up, it is way more human and important to keep things simple and to reduce the chance of wandering rather than play something that's not so practical, not very safe, and then ending up wandering. So for example, after knight e6, okay, queen e7 was played, and okay, white is still fine, but less fine than they were. Now there is this annoying pin. And here after rook takes d5, queen to e6 was played. There is some, I don't want, this is way below even my level, but apparently bishop d6 was a move that actually gave black very serious chances, or much better chances of saving the game, but that's not beside the point. And here queen takes e6 was played. And here this is a very curious moment. I don't want to make fun of anybody, but this is like something that happens all the time at this level. So if you are white here, what do you do? So as I said, you are material up. All I want to do is exchange pieces and remain material up. And especially in those positions, you want to exchange queens, because queens are very dangerous pieces with most attacking potential. So a very simple solution would be take the queen, queen takes c6, rook takes c6, and now rook takes c5. And at the end of it, you have a clear bishop up, and as well as one extra pawn. And this position should be easily, trivially won, objectively speaking. Yet instead, either due to panic or due to, it's hard to explain why, white probably missed that the rook is behind the queen and then played rook to e5. And this just was the rook, queen takes e5, and now suddenly black is up a full rook and should objectively be winning. And after queen to c4, king h8, bishop a4 came, and now black spent 2 minutes on this move, which I think is good sign. Means that they tried, but again black played queen to f6, forgetting that the bishop on c5 is unprotected. So when you are thinking about a position like this, what you might ask yourself is, what are some of the pieces that are not very protected? And I think this is within the capacity of any player, because you will notice, wait, my bishop on c5 is a little bit exposed. It is only protected by the queen, so the queen has to keep defending it. So any move that protects that bishop, for example, queen to e7, was more than fine, and black would have kept an extra rook. And now after queen to f6, queen to c5, we have this strange position where white has a bishop and a pawn, which is 4 points, and black has a rook, which is 5 points. Nominally, black has slight material advantage, but this is now very complicated, very imbalanced, and totally unclear, not only at this level. So after rook to d8, g3 was played, c6, bishop c7, rook d5. I won't delve too deep on these points, but I want to navigate to this moment when after rook d7, it is white to move now. And now white failed to recognize that this pin is potentially very dangerous. And white should move the queen here with queen to a5, but instead they played a4, which is another tactical blunder, because here black can actually win a piece. It is not the most easy win of a piece. I would expect this tactic is a little bit above the level of the players in this game, but still, it is a tactic that is maybe not totally impossible to see, because if black sees, okay, this bishop, I just played rook d7 to pin the bishop and to attack it, and why shouldn't I attack it again? And if the right way of doing so is with queen to f7, because you are protecting this rook and you are also attacking the bishop on c7. And if white plays bishop to e5 check, you take with the rook, and if they give queen to b8 check, this is the difficult part, by the way. You have to see that you can either go back with the rook or even play queen to e8. So this is like a tactic, but a tactic that needs to be followed up with 1 or 2 moves. So it is a little bit more excusable, let's say, or not so unrealistic to miss compared to some other tactics in the game. But as you see, the underlying theme of this game is tactical blunders are galore. So it is clear that main problem of these two players are some relatively basic tactics, and a really good way of improving it is just simply playing more, but also making it a daily routine to practice some tactics, ideally devoted into thematic, like divided by theme, for example, pin, discovered attack, hanging pieces, and so on. And here after queen to f8, which was the move, now actually black is the one to blunder, because now this rook is unprotected, and white can win it with bishop to e5, rook to e5, queen to d7. Now white remains 2 pawns up, and they win an exchange back. And this is nominally winning for white because of the 2 extra pawns and this pawn. But that's now, the evaluation is beside the point. But this is like the tactical shot that white misses. However, white plays f4, preparing bishop to e5. So they saw the right idea, but they didn't look for checks. So because that's why they say you should always look for checks, because bishop to e5 is actually a check. And if you consider that check, you might even see the follow-up. And after f4, here black once again fails to play queen to f7 with the very same point. Bishop to e5, rook takes, queen check, rook e8. Everything is covered. But they play rook e to e7, which is a good idea, trying to win the bishop. And by the way, I think I know what happened here. Black saw that they can play rook e7 here, and then they saw this check, and that the bishop escapes. So the point of queen to f8 is to prevent queen to b8 and to prepare rook e to e7. But as we can see, this is very, very flawed. So tactics are simply, you need to pay more attention to tactics, especially at this level, especially in these types of positions where you can see that certain pieces are not very well protected. And now, so after rook e to e7, white finally found bishop to e5 because they were kind of forced to play it as well. And after rook takes e5, which is a blunder, by the way, you can play king to g8 and not give back the exchange. After rook to e5, black probably missed that white doesn't take the rook back because then they lose the queen, but they play queen to d7. And now white has won an exchange back. And once again, we have this very similar with this endgame where white has 2 extra pawns. And now, after queen to c5, white plays rook to f2. This is, by the way, now a very difficult position to play for players with both levels, because both kings are relatively unsafe, and this is simply a position where very little experience is, it's a little bit tricky to coordinate the pieces, to play with limited pieces, and also to play with such unsafe kings to understand what is the priority. So mistakes that will happen are kind of understandable and easier to expect than, for example, some mistakes seen earlier, such as missed mate in 1. So after rook f2, rook e1, king g2, h5, queen d8 was played. Here you can play as black, for example, white queen d4 and exchange queens. As I said, you really want to exchange queens. But queen d8, king h7, and now comes one of the culminating moments in the game, because white here plays rook to d2. And this is an understandable move, because white wants to play rook d7 check and then mate the king. But in doing so, white underestimates that their own king is in danger. And after queen to g1, king to f3, here rook e3 would have ended the game. It would have been a mate. Now, once again, it is a little bit understandable, kind of, that black didn't see this, because this requires some knowledge of mating patterns. It is not the most common mating pattern, and this is the only move that mates, because queen to e3, king to g2 is not yet mate. It will be very, very soon. But so once again, if I were the white's coach or black's coach, I wouldn't reprimand them too much for this one. Although I would say, hey, look for checks like for all the checks in such a position. But I would maybe emphasize the urgency to practice tactics earlier in the game. So after queen to f1, which was the black's choice, white does have rook to f2. And now the final culminating moment in the game, the final mistake, black plays rook e2 here, correctly understanding that the rook can't take because of the pin, but forgetting that rook to f1 is possible, that the queen, the piece that is spinning, is under attack and is not protected. So this is an error, another tactical error that causes with lack that is caused by lack of knowledge and pattern recognition in terms of pin. So yeah, after rook f1, black resigned. In order to conclude, there were quite a few mistakes committed in this game, but if we had to isolate and mention the most important ones, I would divide them in roughly 3 categories. First one would definitely be playing too fast. Both players used very little time throughout the game, and they ended up with too much time on the clock at the end of it. This is unfortunately not only a mistake that's restricted to this level, but it is very typical of this level, and I would advise you to use more time. 2. Not counting attackers and defenders correctly, not capturing hanging pieces, and not doing a basic blunder check. On one hand, you could label all this as tactical mistakes, but I do think there are different types of tactical mistakes, and I think the origins of these ones are simply not doing those basic blunder checks, not paying attention to the hanging pieces, not asking themselves, what did my opponent just do? What is their threat? And 3, missing basic tactical opportunities in relation to the typical tactical tricks. For example, we have seen a lot of the pins were missed, a lot of the discovered attacks were missed, and other types of tactics. This is, let's say, something that is a little bit more difficult to correct and takes more time, experience, and practice, but I would advise all the users or all the viewers at this level to practice their tactics regularly and to do it so in division by certain tactical elements. So one day I'm only doing pins, the other day I'm only doing discovered attacks, and so on and so forth. Lichess, among other resources, has a very great and free puzzle database where you can do exactly that. Of course, there were some other mistakes, but I don't think they are as urgent, as relevant at this level as those 3 I have just mentioned. So this brings me to the conclusion of this very first video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it instructive. If you, I have to mention the PGN with my annotations for this video, just like for almost all other videos, is available on the Lichess. You can find it in the link below. If you would like to have your game analyzed, feel free to contact me and send it to me. The submissions are open and I do want to keep this series going. And if not, thank you very much for watching the video. You might want to check some other videos on the channel and stay tuned for more videos in the future. Thank you and goodbye.